Two stories by Carol Ann Seflinger. 1. Annie. She sits perched atop my dresser, ever watchful, even ever watchful, though one eye is barely open. Her hair, once radiant and full of life, is now grotesquely shorn with strange ridges and clumps that would frighten even the most stoic of children. I was the stylist who created that abomination many, many years ago. Her original tattered dress was replaced quite some time ago, but the dress she now sports is at least 2 sizes too large and was meant for a human toddler, not my Annie. We don't they don't make dresses in her size anymore, and perhaps that's just as well. The missized dress matches her hair. She's one adorable mess now, and even her socks don't quite fit. The socks were gifted to me by my husband one year when we traveled and I realized I was short a pair or two. Said husband, for some reason, bought me a tiny child-sized pair, so after a good laugh over them, I promptly added them to Annie's wardrobe and thanked him for the thought, even if it was unintentional. Annie's full name is Annie Carroll. She was born 1 year after I was, and when I was old enough to name her, and being the only girl with 4 other brothers, I decided to give her my name in reverse. So from Carol Ann, she became Annie Carroll. I was told she looked just like my twin when I was a small 1 year old, except for her lovely blue eyes. Her dark hair might have gone better with brown or hazel eyes, but back then, everyone apparently wanted blue eyes and not the manufacturers gave them, so the manufacturers gave them to my brunette Annie. In a sense, she is my polar opposite, just like her name. She is calm, accepting, tolerant of all my foibles, and silently wise. Annie knows all my secrets. She's been witness to all my heartaches, all my aspirations, all my temperamental outbursts, and still she remains ever watchful, far mellower than her twin, though her hair is quite alarming, as are the missing eyelashes on the one eyelid that almost never stays quite fully open. And though she is wearing someone else's dress and the socks my husband thought would fit my small but most definitely not doll-sized feet, she seems grateful to be here with me, my tiny protector, because she knows she is loved by me and now bemusedly tolerated by my husband. Wherever I go, she'll be there. She's the sister and daughter I never had. She's a part of me. She's Annie Carroll. 2. My mother's doll. As I was the youngest of 5 and the only girl, my mother really enjoyed making clothes for me and, a few years later, shopping for them with me. In fact, it sometimes felt to me as if I were a doll for her to dress. In addition to being the only daughter, I started acting when I was around 4 years old, which gave my mother 2 reasons to fuss over me. By the time I was in junior high, my mother discovered a store in the then newly created shopping mall, Topanga Plaza in Woodland Hills, where they would tailor the outfits they sold. Since I was small for my age and rather thin, a lot of tailoring was necessary to have me fitted for these somewhat Mad Men-styled outfits for my first year of junior high school. Plus, I was only 11 when I entered junior high, and I looked about 9 years at that. Please keep in mind that girls were not yet allowed to wear pants to school, so we all wore skirts or dresses, but these clothes still made quite the statement. I was almost persuaded to believe this was the look for me, even though I was more of a tomboy when I wasn't acting, since I had grown up with only brothers to play with, or should I say tag along after. But I did like the way the clothes fit and seemed to flatter me, and so I went along with this evil plan to be my mother's living doll. In actuality, these were our special bonding times, and I reveled in them. My life at home was often gloomy since my parents were always fighting, sometimes even violently. Thus, I did treasure those rare mother-daughter outings, even if it meant that I had to try on endless outfits to find one we could both agree on. It was only recently I remembered our outings to a store called Tamara's, and while I eventually made more of my own choices and wore more youthful and popular preteen and teen styles, those few outfits I had still remain, in my mind, the most sophisticated articles of clothing I've ever owned, and I believe the closest to the way my mother would have dressed had she been allowed to have a career, instead of being dragged out of night school by my father as soon as they started dating, so he'd have her to himself every night before they married, followed by her being relegated to starting a family and catering to her husband thereafter. Still, even after my having learned all that, and despite his rather controlling behavior, I did have a bond with my father. He always called me his spitting image, and we loved exploring nature together, even if just in our backyard, and we both were a lot more social than my mother. So at times, I was torn between my love and appreciation for her and my special connection with him. But I was also very frightened of his temper, which, along with his very old world ways, made us all walk on eggshells most of the time. He was the king of the castle, and so I guess we were all his minions, even I, his spitting image. Perhaps partly because he resented the time my mother took to drive me to my auditions after school, and her being on the set with me all day during shoots, which, other than shopping with me and running errands for her main escape, he treated the money I earned as a child as if it were intended for household expenses, such as making improvements on our home, including adding a bedroom and a backyard porch to the house. Finally, after most of my earnings had already been spent, my mother created an account in my name to protect any future income. She called it a trust fund, but what ended up in there after all the home improvement projects was barely enough to buy me a used car. So much for the Jackie Coogan law that supposedly protected child actors' earnings. I believe that misuse of my earnings by my father may have been one reason why my mother decided to buy me these fairly expensive outfits when I was a preteen. It was the safest way for her to lash out since she could just explain it away as necessary for auditions. How else could I help to do further renovations on our home if I didn't get those gigs? All of this is connected, however tangentially, to my recent revelation that when my mother was becoming less lucid when she was nearing 90, and she asked me if I could get her a doll that looked just like me, that for her, the doll would represent both me as a child and perhaps the daughter I would never have that would also have been her granddaughter. Even though she did have grandchildren from my older siblings, I believe she felt this would have been different because since I'm her only daughter, she might have wanted to be with me every step of the way throughout my pregnancy and beyond. My mother never pressed me to have children. She always wanted me to pursue my dreams, however I saw fit to do so. But in the back of my mind, I always knew she would have preferred I married earlier instead of 43, so that I could start a family, something I never planned on nor desired, though other than that, I would do anything for my mother, not only because of our powerful mother-daughter bond, but also because of all that she sacrificed for her children and all she endured before she even got on a boat from Poland when she was 10 years old. I did not get a doll for my mother because I knew she needed my presence more than a doll. So I visited her nearly every day, and every time I would meet up with her and my brother, the one who lived with her, at a restaurant. As soon as she'd see me enter that restaurant, she'd call out, "There's my baby." And that was why I didn't get her a doll. I was my mother's baby, her doll. So now when I see my child in my doll Annie, I see my mother's grandchild as well. Even though Annie started out as the sister I never had and not my make-believe daughter. Her blue eyes are my mother's eyes, and their watchfulness is like my mother's blue eyes always watching over me, worrying about my future, my past, my wayward ways, my inability and or lack of interest in dressing the way she desired and had tried to instill in me, and her need to live vicariously through me since she missed out on so much of her own life. My Annie and my mother, the two focal points in my life. I made mistakes with Annie by chopping up her hair when I was a child and later neglecting her for too long. And my mother may have made a few mistakes with me, both by giving me too much freedom in the 1960s, no less, and by needing me to live up to some ideal that always eluded me and never quite captivated me the way it had her. Not all dolls do what their owners want. However, despite any regrets she may have had for how my life turned out, my most enduring memory of my mother's advice was what she told me each time we were at an audition just before I walked into the office. Just be yourself and have fun. That I've done, Mom. That I've always done, for better or for worse. The end.
That was great.
Yeah, that's always like a fun one to read.
Yeah, I really enjoyed listening it to this time, and like what really stood out to me was just the relationship between her and her mom. This is a different time period too. Like what a great mom she was, how supportive she was.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, and for her to come from making that whole journey, like coming from Poland and coming to a new country and starting her own family and having, going through such a time, there's so much in the story that isn't said. That's very compelling. And
I
yeah.
also
And I
go
go ahead.
No, you.
No, you, Jeremy, you go. I was just going to say that I find it fascinating when people have connections like this to inanimate objects. Like I myself get so attached to things that don't live and breathe. And I often, it just feels so instinctual to do it too. And I sometimes second guess myself, but then I'm like, oh, well, I can't help the way I feel about this thing that I don't want to see get destroyed.
Yeah, I think she had a knack for making something that could be creepy not creepy at all. Because this isn't a child talking about her doll. What I liked in particular with the second piece is that the doll takes on a new meaning from the beginning of the story to the end. It becomes a representation of her mom, her mom passing away. So yeah, so I was able to interview Carol Ann before. Unfortunately, with COVID, we can't do live interviews, but it was a great interview, and we're going to show you that now. Thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure.
So Carol Ann comes to us from Los Angeles. Carol Ann, how long have you been in Los Angeles?
I was born and raised here, native.
That's awesome. You're a
native,
rarity.
I'm a native Valley girl, even.
Oh yeah.
So,
can you do a Valley girl accent?
No, I can't really, because I'm pre-Valley girl accent. So.
Okay. Was that weird when it like came? Like it was like in the 80s, right? That the Valley girl accent came.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. It was fun. I liked it, and I have heard people speak like that. And what I love is what still exists is the voice going up at the end of a statement like it's a question. Oh my gosh. That still exists.
Yeah, it's everywhere now. That's everywhere.
I know. So I went to the store, and when I was at the store, I saw this guy. It's like, what? What do you? Should I answer?
I love that. Carol Ann, for people who don't know you, like, do you want to talk about yourself a little bit, like who you are and what you do, what you're passionate about?
Oh, sure. Okay. Well, as you heard already, I guess, in one of the pieces, I was a child actor. I'm still in the union, but I did a lot of work as a child. I still love acting. I sort of transferred over into doing some voiceover here and there, and plays. I love plays, and I love writing plays. I got into writing because I wanted to use original monologues. So I started writing my own monologues, and little by little that turned into plays, and then I started writing short stories. And in this case, these are little memoir short stories, but I write a lot of total fiction. And I really love writing. And I love that you can write in your pajamas. You don't have to worry about how you look when you write. And and I tutor, and I love tutoring. I have a master's in linguistics, and so a lot of language work, things like that. But I mean, I tutor everything for smaller, pardon me. Again, I mentioned I have a frog in my throat.
Allergies in LA, there's a whole bunch of allergies right now.
Right, and that's all it is, folks. Plus, nothing's contagious.
So don't worry.
Nothing's contagious on the video. But anyway, so I love tutoring, I love writing, and I love acting, and everything to do with all of those.
Well, thank you so much for having your pieces on the show.
Oh my.
When I heard it, we happened to go to writers group together. For those people listening, and when she presented Annie, I was just really into it. It was a really interesting story from an interesting perspective. Carol Ann, I have questions for you. Are you ready for them?
Okay, I think so.
So, why the doll motif in both pieces?
The second piece I wrote later, My Mother's Doll, happened because after I wrote Annie, Annie is still in my husband and my bedroom. She's featured at the window. She's just there all the time. And so that's what inspired me, of course, to write the first piece. But when I looked at her one day and just my mind started wandering, and I flashed on something that happened before my mother passed away in 2010. The last few years of her life, she had a lot of little mini strokes. She never had Alzheimer's, but she started losing her ability to communicate totally. She recognized all of us all the time. She was fine. And she lived to be in 97. So we were very fortunate. So, but she started asking me for a doll. And as you'll hear in this or heard in the stories, I looked at Annie, and all of a sudden I remembered that.
Was this the first one? Was this Annie the first one that we're going to hear that inspired this trigger, just for the audience?
Yes, the first one inspired the trigger for the second one. The first one was just sort of a meditation on her. And the second one was sort of like, oh my God, it just reminded me. It just all came back to me about my mom asking, I want a doll that looks like you. And
oh my gosh, is that what she said? I want a doll that looks like you?
Yes. And she brought it up, not just one day. She brought it up maybe 4 or 5 of my visits to her. And so it was like a thing. And I didn't know what to say. I couldn't get a doll that looked like me, but I made sure, as I mentioned in the piece, to visit all the time. So
it's really touching.
So anyway, so that's, and it was triggered by a memory. It's not like I repressed the memory, but I didn't think about it for a while because she passed 10 years ago. And then all of a sudden it just whooshed back at me.
Yeah, related to I want a doll that looks like you. Can you relate that to the piece, the second piece, My Mother's Doll, a little bit? Like how that expanded into the story?
Well, that's the one. That's
Right.
The one that was about eventually my mom asking for a doll that looked like me. And all of a sudden, my memories of being a child actor, dealing with some stuff, issues between my mother and my father, and all of that, that came from my remembering her wanting a doll that looked like me, because I never had kids. I never had a little girl. And even though my much, much, much older brothers, because my oldest brother is 19 years older than I am, they had kids, I'm the only girl. So it would have been her granddaughter in her mind from me. So that's why in my mind, the doll that looks like me is also her wanting me to be that little child she remembered, and her wanting a baby of mine to be her granddaughter. So that's where that piece came from, My Mother's Doll.
That's really touching, and thank you for being so vulnerable, Carol Ann. It's really lovely. It's really beautiful. I think you're going to really connect with the listeners. Going with that, focusing in on the second piece, what did you get from writing that afterward, Carol Ann?
Communicating things, it's not that they were repressed memories, but they were things I don't think about on a daily basis. Again, I'm of a certain age, let's just say that, being an actor, we don't say more than that, but my childhood is way long time ago. And all of a sudden I'd start remembering more and more things about what happened back then. I've written things about my youth before, but this one was different. Yeah. So it just, things came back as I started writing. It started with the trigger. It started with my writing about my mom asking me that. And then I started remembering all the things she didn't get to do, all the things she was deprived of doing. And it all just, everything for me, that some of her last communications to me were about wanting that doll. Not on her deathbed, not like that, but I mean the last few years where she could really communicate. But even, and I don't know if I wrote this, I think it's in the piece. I should look before I say this, but anyway. even up to the last few times I would visit, because she lived with my brother, who's still around. He still lives in the house they lived in together because he never married, and he's an older brother. When I would meet them, even when she didn't communicate much at all, as soon as I walked into the coffee shop, I think that's in there, I'm not sure, she'd go, "There's my baby!" And I was always her baby. So that's a part of my mother's doll. I mean, yeah, I know I'm the youngest, I'm the only girl, all of that. And so that "there's my baby" is that part of this whole thing.
Did she ever talk to you about the things that she wasn't able to do? Because I know that you told me that you were really, really close with your mom.
Yes, she loved dancing, and she actually had a beautiful voice. But she came over from Poland when she was 10 years old, and her mother had come over earlier, so she was on the ship alone at 10. Okay, we're talking a long time ago. And so she got scared when somebody wanted to take her on the road to dance Adagio. She was 15 and he was like maybe in his early 20s, and so she was afraid of that. So she chickened out of that. And then later on she realized that was an opportunity for her. Then when she met my father, before they got married, she had gone to night school because she had to work. She had to work as a teenager, you know, to help earn money in the family. And he just said, "No, you know, I need you to myself." And he didn't trust her to, so he took her out of night school, and then basically she was relegated to nothing wrong with this, but to only having children and keeping the home. And then eventually, after they divorced, a few years before he passed, she finally started getting like a part-time job at a department store, you know, but not the kinds of things she had dreams about. And that's why she got my brother. I don't mention that, but my second, okay, 4 older brothers, the youngest of the older brothers and I were both entered into a picture contest, which is how we got into acting. I was a baby. I was 15 months old, and he was 2.5.
Well, let's talk about that, Carol Ann. Carol Ann was a child actress. Please talk about that.
Right.
It's really interesting, guys.
Well, okay, so there were no connections. A lot of people, "Oh, who did you know?" No, it was a picture contest for Little Mr. and Miss America, and we were runners up. We weren't the winners. I don't remember, but I was 15 months old, and when the picture was taken, and my brother is 2.5 years older than me, so he would have been like 3, I guess. Anyways, and we paraded on at the Greek Theater. We would walk across the stage and we'd be judged. And I guess I walked when I was 8 months old, so I was fine at 15 months. But I'm sure my mom or somebody walked with us. I don't know how that worked. But anyway, we were runners up, and the runners up got into what was then called the Screen Children's Guild. Well, the Screen Children's Guild eventually folded into the Screen Actors Guild, which is really what it was. It was the union guild. My brother didn't want to keep acting, and he never got really big parts, and he wasn't really into it. And so, but he was adorable, but he wasn't like into acting, and I was. So I kept going, and I kept getting bigger parts, and I learned by doing.
I don't remember who it was, but who held you in their arms? Like you said that. Who was that?
Clint Eastwood.
Clint Eastwood held Carol Ann in his arms.
Right, in the show Rawhide, where he was adorable. I mean, before he got really hard looking, he was just gorgeous. I had a crush on him when I was 7. I was 7. And there's a thing where I'm supposed to jump over a fire, and even though it's jets shooting up, it's real fire. And it's supposedly they're going to burn this woman as a witch at the stake. And I'm running over to get my dolly. I mean, I should have kept that in the motif. But anyway, it's like I want my dolly throughout the whole thing. Well, to jump over that, they took the camera off for a second so he could pick me up and put me over the other side of the fire. So yeah. And then after one of the scenes, it's the only time I've ever gotten a standing ovation because I was screaming through the forest at a different scene. "I want my dolly, I want my dolly." And they were jumping out from behind hollow trees, screaming, "Scream!" And it was like, "Ah!" And I was 7 and I never did a dramatic part before. So I'm screaming. And at the end of it, I was shaking. And everybody stood up, including Clint Eastwood. Everybody. Gil Favor was played by Eric Fleming, was the star of Rawhide. All of them stood up and gave me a standing ovation.
Carol Ann, I'll plug you at the end too, but you're so intriguing. She's making this interview really difficult because we should be talking about her short story. And
sorry.
But that's
yes,
not
sorry.
your fault. It's mine. Like, I'm just so interested in your stories. So Carol Ann, where can we find more of you? Like after this interview?
Find more of
Yes.
me in
So
regards
search
to
you up.
writing, acting.
All of it.
Oh, well, you could probably Google Carol Ann Seflinger, but it's not all great stuff. But I'm on a lot of acting sites, whether I stay on them or not. Right now, I'm on Actors Access. I'm on. I think I got rid of one of them. I'm on LA Casting. I'm on. You could find, and I'm on iActor on Screen Actors Guild site, the SAG-AFTRA site. Which it seems like they're in the middle of maybe eventually improving it because it's a little inky right now.
Put some links
but
for
I
Carol
don't.
Ann down below, so you'll be able to stalk her. Carol Ann, going back to
in a nice
wait,
way.
sorry.
In a nice
In a
way,
nice
please.
way. In a nice way. Don't you dare stalk her in a mean way. Carol Ann's too nice for that. So going back to the questions, you were talking a little bit about your father, and then from talking to you like before this interview, you mentioned that he was the antagonist. Would you be open to talking about that a little bit further on like what you got from writing it after?
Yes, it sort of reminded me. He was the antagonist in that he had a bad temper, and he kind of kept my mom from having as much freedom as she would have wanted. Like it was the era, but even he was much more conservative than that. His thing was, I'm king of the castle, and so everybody must obey his rules, that kind of thing. And he had a temper that scared all of us. But at the same time, it reminded me how he and I used to go outside, and he'd show me how to gently catch a grasshopper and then let it go, and things like that in nature. He loved nature. And so even though he was like, he ran a carpet store, he wasn't like an outdoorsy guy. I mean, Jews just aren't, frankly. We don't go camping, No, but anyway, there was a connection. And even when I was upset with him, he would say, I could read you like a book. That was one of his expressions. The other one is he called me his spitting image. And I think that's in the piece. So there was a connection between us. We both had hazel eyes, I still do, and dark hair. And my mom was blonde and blue-eyed. So we had that weird mixture in the family. He and I were more social. I mentioned that too. My mom was a little shyer, partly because of what she wasn't allowed to do and things like that. But she didn't like parties, and he liked parties, and I liked parties. So I knew I took after him in some ways, just not that temper.
Well, that's what's
no matter what my husband says, not that temper.
I mean, that's fascinating. I was having to do the interview with Megan for my piece, and one of the things that we learned from that is that the antagonist of that piece is a nice lady, So what's interesting is that we're all shades of gray, And you even mentioned it in your piece. I thought that was great that you mentioned the good and the more difficult things about your father.
Right,
Yeah.
that he and I have a bond anyways, even with all the issues. Yeah.
What which story was the hardest for you to write?
My mother's doll, because the first one was kind of it just made me feel like this. I don't know how to explain it. I'm a writer. I don't know how to explain it. It was just this feeling of just this joy at writing about my doll. This like a memory piece, a meditation on her. The second one brought up things from my past, and also my loss of my mom. Even though I was blessed to have her as long as I did, she was 40 when I was born, so it wasn't like we were that close in age, like we do mother-daughter things a lot because we just didn't, but we had a connection. We had a really strong connection. But it brought up the fighting in the house. It brought up things that I had written about before and other things. My dad trying to hold the car back when my mom was going to take me on an interview because she might not be home in time for his dinner. to place it on the table as soon as he walked in the door. Things like
Mm.
that. So it brought up a lot of stuff.
What was that one of the hardest things about writing it is the stuff it brought up?
Um, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, thank you for being here and thank you for being so vulnerable, not only here. This was a beautiful interview, but also in your pieces. Like, I really appreciate you being part of the project.
Oh, well, thank you, Jeremy, for the opportunity. You and Megan are amazing, and yeah, for doing
Thank
this.
you,
You know?
Carol Ann. Make sure to look in a nice way at Carol Ann's links down below. Um, like and subscribe this video. Yeah, and if you have any questions for Carol Ann about her doll, Carol Ann, you said you might show off your doll. Do you want to do that today?
Oh, yes, 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 yes.
Oh
Sorry.
my goodness!
This, this is it. I mentioned how I cut her hair and I expected it to grow back. I was maybe 3 at the time. So as you can see, it did not. She's a little balding. But anyway, and she has blue eyes, not like me.
Wait, closer up.
But,
We need a closer up of her. I'm going to describe
oh,
her to. Wait, actually, let's both describe her to the podcast listeners who won't be able to see this.
oh,
Okay,
okay, right.
so she has very little hair, no eyebrows. What? How else can we describe her?
Um, she has blue eyes, which unfortunately all dolls had blue eyes back then. So my parents tried to find hazel or even brown, but
We
they're
know
blue.
she has a good personality from the piece, but if you were to see her at night, not knowing anything about her,
You'd be
it would be
scared.
like the beginning of a horror movie.
And these were the socks my husband bought for me that he thought would fit me. For those of you who can't see, they probably would fit a
Oh my
3-year old.
goodness. Wait,
So they're too
lift it a little
big for
higher for the
Annie.
YouTube listeners.
Okay, yes.
Oh
So
my
there's
goodness, that's hilarious.
the sock he bought for me. And this was because hers was falling apart, her own doll dress. So I bought the smallest size I could find in a department store, but it's too big for
Well,
her.
thank you, Carolyn. Thank you so much. So that's it for tonight. We hope you enjoyed the stories and interview for Carol Ann Seflinger. Join us next week for The Cleaner by Michelle Murphy Whalen. A building manager deals with the regrets of how she dealt with one of her employees. Please remember to like us and subscribe on YouTube. That helps us so much. And if you're a podcast listener, you can also find this on Spotify, iTunes, and Stitcher. Thank you for listening. Good night.
No one reads short stories anymore. I really don't know what they're written for. Go write a short story and throw it out the door. 'Cause no one reads short stories, funny, sad, or gory. No one reads short stories